Hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours and Beyond the Headlines. Christopher de Bellaigue has written some great books on Iran, Turkey, and more recently Islam. But in the last year, he's turned the pen on himself and begun to investigate an issue that's far more personal: his mother's suicide when he was aged just 13. It is, needless to say, an extremely difficult subject to tackle, but it is, if I may say so, an extremely timely one. With lockdowns and confinement, we are all having to cope with periods of enforced isolation, depression, and dark thoughts, if not necessarily thoughts of suicide. And these all have to be issues that many contend with. The era of the stiff upper lip may be a thing of the past in Britain and elsewhere, but I think it lives on in some lives and families. So this next hour is not about politics, but it is, in a way, about our time. Hello, Christopher. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Nick.
Last March, I think it was last March, you published your diary in the London Review of Books, in which for the first time you tackled your mother's death. This is a pretty sort of hard introduction to this, but can you just talk a bit about the start of that article and really that day itself?
Well, the article was a kind of distillation of a 5-year period in my life, beginning with the start of my mother's mental illness. I was too young really to realize what was going on. And as you mentioned, the area of the stiff upper lip was very much alive and well. And so that meant that as a young boy with a mother who was desperately depressed, I was shielded, or so people thought, from a great deal of what was going on. And the beginning of the piece, which is in a way the climax and culmination of that period of agony, was the moment when I was at boarding school at Eton, my first term there. And one Sunday afternoon, my housemaster called me in and handed over the telephone. It was my father's voice. And he told me that my mother was dead. Now, that was an entire and complete shock to me, because I hadn't seen that coming. I hadn't been aware that my mother's illness was in any way life-threatening. I had only the vaguest idea of what suicide was. It wasn't something that one really discussed. And I went out into the streets. My housemaster didn't really know how to deal with this situation as I waited for my father to come down. And I went out into the street for what he euphemistically termed a breath of fresh air, which in fact I did need. And I bumped into a friend of mine and I told him that my mother was dead. I just blurted it out. And he was much more worldly than I was. And after a few minutes of saying, "I'm so sorry," and he said, "So how did she die?" And I was unable to tell him. And it was only several months or even several years, I can't remember the precise moment, that I worked out myself that she'd taken her own life. And the piece is really about, it's about that silence. It's about the silence that surrounds someone, whether through fear or through some misguided idea about their own protection and their own good. But that silence was pervasive. It was pervasive across British society in the 1980s. It was certainly pervasive in the social class and the school and that kind of background to which I was accustomed. The idea of airing painful subjects, then working through them in a very painful way, was something that our society didn't agree with. It was 100 years old, that idea, or maybe more. It was considered unhealthy. And so by the end of that piece, I have worked through that, and I've done it myself 30 or 35 years later.
Yeah. In a moment, in a bit, we're going to come on to talking about the relationship with your aunt, which I think is of key to you working things out, and also we'll talk a bit about the what happened within the family as well. But just before we get there, I mean, can you just talk a bit more about being back at school? And one of the things that struck me in the article was that you knew you couldn't cry, you shouldn't cry, it was contemptible.
To cry was something in an all-boys school in the 1980s was an admission of defeat. It was, as you say, it was contemptible. If one got hurt in sport, you just did everything you could to not cry. It was very, very important not to cry, because if you cried, you were a crybaby. Now that that ethos or that approach to pain was defined by the small things, getting hit by a ball very hard in your balls, for example. This is on a different order, but we were not equipped to distinguish between the large pain and the smaller pain. They were all really part of the same category. And that category was something that we needed to fight. It wasn't something that we needed to acknowledge, accept, discuss, air, in order, therefore, to go on and to recover. It was something that you needed to fight. And so from the very moment that I heard the news, I was fighting. I was somehow in a struggle.
Yeah. The thing that comes through both in the article and also you did a long recording or a program for the BBC, and that's the sort of cycle of trauma that can be passed from one generation to the next. And in a moment, we're going to play a couple of clips from an interview you did with your aunt. But in order to get there, can you just explain who your aunt was? And you had to go all the way over to Vancouver Island, right the other side of Canada, to talk to her. And this is also where your mother was buried. So that the story is all intertwined, and also with the history of your family. So perhaps maybe just say, how did your family come to be there, for starters?
My mother's family was English, an aristocratic English family that had fallen on hard times financially. And for reasons that at that age I was unfamiliar with, had decided to move to Canada. This was immediately after the First World War. And they moved to a farm in the prairies. Neither of my grandparents had ever farmed before. They didn't have very much money. They had no experience, but they decided to make a go of it in the prairies. And that was where my mother was brought up. Of the 5 children of that family, one was killed in the war. Another ended up living in England. My mother ended up living in England. And then my aunt and another uncle ended up living in Canada. It was only much later that I began to glean the reasons for the emigration that took place in 1919 after the war. And they were, as you can imagine, a whole range of reasons. One of them was financial insecurity. My grandparents' generation were of that generation that lost a great deal in the late 19th century. But it was also an unspoken history of family trauma. To say that on both sides of the family were dysfunctional is something of an understatement. The families were so my grandparents essentially fled their background and their upbringing to try and make a new life. It was an ill-conceived idea, and in many ways it didn't work. What it did leave behind was this aunt, this older sister of my mother, who, after my mother's death, I hadn't been close to her at all when my mother was alive. She was, half a world away. After my mother's death, she took a close interest in me and was animated by a great compassion, and also by an ability that to me just seems absolutely extraordinary, to identify this illness of silence and to say that the only way you're going to get through a trauma is by airing it and speaking about it. And if you haven't grieved, then you need to grieve. And so she became my confidant.
Well, we've got a couple of clips here, and I do recommend everyone to listen to this. This is on BBC Sounds. You can go online and find this on the BBC Sounds website, and it's called A Life Alone. And we've got a couple of clips here just now. So Isabel's just going to bring that one up, and we're going to the first one we're going to play is really about your aunt. It's Diana, is that right, Diana?
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah, talking about just feeling depressed, feeling alone. So here's the first one coming up just now.
Sometimes when I phone Aunt Diana, you sound exhausted because you haven't really slept. How is the night for you?
I have a horrible night most of the time. Just get thinking and thinking. I guess I always sort of worry things.
So you're anxious at night?
I suppose so, yes. For me, everything's sort of hard and not really worthwhile. Sort of everything is dark looking.
So it's an effort to get out of bed, it's an effort?
Everything's an effort.
It's an effort to...
It doesn't seem worthwhile.
So it's a kind of sluggishness?
Well, it's more than that.
In 1941, the one sibling who might have made a lasting difference to Diana's sense of isolation, George, the oldest of the five, was killed over the southern Mediterranean. Another abandonment to add to all the others. Now, decades later, isolation has been further sharpened by age. Diana doesn't have any contemporaries left. The nice Canadian women who have rallied round, taking her shopping and helping in the garden, are a generation or two younger than her.
So, and the next one we're going to take up on is about a letter that she wrote to you. And you, when your mother died, she was buried in Canada, and you had to take that journey. You had to fly all the way there, and to take part in the funeral, which at the age of 13, obviously, it was a huge journey and a terrible thing to undergo. But your aunt then writes to you, and we've got a clip here of you reading the letter that she sent to you at school. So we'll just bring that one up now. It may take a second or two just to pull up here just now.
Diana became the only person I could speak to about it. So here's the paradox. For someone without friends, Diana has an amazing capacity for friendship.
I've got a letter here that you wrote to me after Mummy died. Dear Christopher, this is just a few lines to give you my address in case you ever want to write, and to tell you how much I admired your courage for coming here and for the way you coped with the situation when you were here. It takes a great deal of courage to allow oneself to honestly face one's feelings and to experience the terrible pain associated with the loss of one's mother, regardless of one's age. I hope that you will never allow yourself to feel that it is unmanly to cry. I will look after your mother's grave for you, and remember what I said. Any time you would like to come out here, I will advance you the money for your fare. You can pay me back when you are old enough to get a job, so that you do not have to feel under any obligation. I send you all my love, Christopher. I'm sure your mother is very proud of you. Lots and lots of love, Aunt Diana.
I'm amazed that I wrote that letter.
You speak a lot about the importance of crying and grief.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't sense that you've
Done it.
I
haven't.
So throughout your childhood, you were bottling things up?
I suppose so. We didn't know so much in those days. It was a stiff upper lip that was so important. And maybe it was part of that era that I lived in.
So, Christopher, there's, it's an incredibly poignant, it's 30 minutes, that program you did with her, and it's really, really gripping, and I do recommend people go and see it. She's tremendously, she's a very lonely figure, and she's sort of aware of it as well. But that was something you were able to talk, and through that with her, you were able to sort of process your own sort of grief. and I hope, and perhaps of break that cycle?
Well, I think that I spoke to her yesterday, and it's only her technological ineptitude that prevents her from being with us now. She is a remarkable person because she has had a very isolated and solitary life, and she's had to work through things in her own mind in the way that so many people have. But she has this capacity for, she doesn't really see that in other people, and she brings an enormous amount of empathy to bear in her relationships with other people. And I've been the beneficiary of that. That letter that was read out just now was the beginning of really a 30-year campaign that she conducted to get me to acknowledge what had happened in the past, to acknowledge that by bottling it up, I was merely creating problems for myself in the future. And ultimately, she is the catalyst for the sort of the confessions that I've made over the last few months or couple of years in this program, in the piece, in a couple of other pieces that I've done, in which I have managed to shed this burden. And I don't want people to think that my situation is in any way exceptional. Things like this happen all the time, but where I think people have been helped, and it is always wonderful to receive messages, as I do constantly, from people who have heard the program or have read the piece and have been affected by it. Where I have been able to help is to point out the necessity of exposition, the necessity of getting things off your chest, of even just expressing them in the form of words. And if you do that, it is not because there's anything intrinsically valuable about confession or saying, look at me, or saying, feel sorry for me. It is a means to an end, and that end is health, is mental health. And she is the person who taught me that. Okay.
I do want to talk a bit more about her and her own experience and the sort of the different generations and how they've the traumas that they've gone through and how that's sort of transported from one generation to the next. Your mother, when you were small, she told you these wonderful stories of living on the prairie, and it sounded like an idyllic childhood, an idyllic upbringing. But when you spoke to your aunt about it, she had a very different take, didn't she?
Yes, my mother was younger than my aunt, and to an extent, her experience of life on the farm was indeed better because she didn't go through the worst of the Depression, whereas my aunt was old enough to remember that. But my mother did substantially have the same upbringing. It was a very, very difficult upbringing. There were obviously moments of great bucolic joy and a kind of oneness with nature that she always missed. But at the same time, it was deeply deracinating. Her parents were always miles away from their natural habitat. They were never, they never had any friends. They were absolutely imprisoned by their own background and their own inability to escape that background. And the day when my uncle George died in the Second World War was a catastrophic day for the whole of the family as well. Now, my mother's reminiscences were wonderful, and she told me all the good things. And my Aunt Diana, partly because that is just the way she is built, was much more honest. And she told me about the terrible periods of great economic hardship, emotional loneliness, and solitude. And as I started to investigate, because from the beginning I was a writer and an investigator in some way, shape, or form, I started to realize that this went back to the family history back in England, where both sides of my of my mother's family, both grandmaternal and grandpaternal, were extremely dysfunctional. There was a lot of cruelty. There was a lot of alcoholism. There was a lot of infidelity. There was yet more cruelty, and you saw it in my aunt's early years when she was born in England. Then she was abandoned. She was left in England with a nurse. The nurse was sadistic. Then she was sent off to a grandfather. The grandfather was sadistic. The only emotional recourse that my Aunt Diana had was with animals, because animals were the only beings that wouldn't let you down, that wouldn't abandon you. And my mother had that perhaps to a lesser degree, but she hid that. And so she presented life on the farm as a bucolic childhood, and it wasn't that.
Yeah, we're getting some questions coming in. Please do put your questions in the Q&A box here on the bottom left-hand side of the screen. Christopher, you wrote about a 6-week period in which your Beta, your wonderful wife, is away with the children in Iran, because that's where her family are. And you're by yourself, and you've got these trunks in the attic, and they're full of letters. They're full of the weight of family history, and you're dealing with this and going through a bit by bit each day. But one thing you also say is that you make sure you don't drink, and that you stop at the end of the day to go and do exercise. And I presume you're talking about your own mental well-being.
Yes, something I knew that this was something I needed to do. My Aunt Diana had said you should write about it, but I knew that I needed not only to write about it, but also to publish or expose what I wrote. And that is an aspect of being a writer, and to a lesser extent, a broadcaster, that may strike some people as very disagreeable. But there is a need for exposition. For some reason, writing and putting it in a drawer wouldn't have done what this act of exposition did do. So I was always thinking about an audience. I was always thinking about reaching out to other people. But in doing so, I needed to, I suppose, I saved a lot of money on psychotherapy fees. Because I was conducting it myself. I was asking the questions, I was providing the answers, and I knew exactly what questions to ask. Something very instinctual in me told me what I needed to ask, what I needed to get onto paper, what aspects of my family life, my parents' life, my mother's life, her parents' life needed to be explored. And I went into the very darkest recesses for those 6 weeks in a process that I'm very proud of. It was controlled, it was agony, but I knew what I was doing. And the result is that I'm sitting here talking to you about it, whereas I would never have been able to do so in the past.
Yeah. We've got some questions coming in. Joe Cleary, a familiar face, who's met Christopher and has travelled with us to Iran. Joe, you've got a question. Go ahead, Joe.
Hello, Christopher. It's lovely to see you again.
Lovely to see you, Joe.
From our journey, memorable journey around Iran. I'm really moved by what you've told me, particularly because we spent time talking together. And you will know that my background is in mental health, and I now coach a lot of people, and I'm very aware of what people hold and what people hide, and I have done over many, many years. I could say a lot more, but what I'm really interested about is you went into this very dark place to do your own psychotherapy, which was a very courageous thing to do. when you started to emerge, what have you communicated to your children? How are you thinking about what they will have felt, sensed in you?
It's a very good question. I think if you go through a process like that, you immediately think it's terribly important. And it is to you, but it may not be to your children. The reason I put myself through that process is to be a more functional father, husband, friend. It wasn't to teach. It wasn't a didactic process. I would hope that at some stage I will be able to pass on a few words of wisdom to them. When that will happen, how it will happen, I don't know. I'm sure most ordinary children feel zero interest in their parents' lives until something quite important happens to them, and then they start thinking, oh, how have people dealt with it before? Is there a pattern here? And then they start thinking. So I haven't. The answer, Joe, is that I haven't, but I might.
But do you think, Christopher, part of the issue is sort of denying that your demons exist, and sort of, you know, when you had a family, started having a family, 14 years ago, 15 years ago, that's that right? And you sort of our behavior, the way we behave, is inevitably going to affect our children. And so if you're in this cloud and you're in sort of denial of these things, it's going to have an effect on them. So I guess in a way, if you are aware that you've been more sensitive to what's happened to you and able to confront it, you know, has it in any way affected them prior to that?
I don't know.
You don't know. You can't say.
I don't know. That is something that only an outsider will be able to, maybe a lover or a spouse or a friend or even someone they meet on a train. It's in a way, I'm the wrong person to.
What would your wife say?
I have no. I don't know. I think she's noticed the difference, and I think she's glad. But in a way, it's a question of perception. What is of vital life, absolutely, you know, crucial importance to me, is actually just getting back on an even keel and being bland and normal, and that is what I think exposition and grief and trauma, getting through the trauma, actually achieves. And I hope that because my children are not going through anything like what I went through, that these questions will arise only in the course of a long and fulfilling life, and they will meet these questions as adults, because we all naturally face trauma of one kind or another. And by that time, they will be mature enough, and they will have been, they will have the examples before them to show that, no, you don't want to bottle it up. You need to talk. You need to get it out. You need to weep. You need to cry. You need to rail and rant. And it is only in that way that you will emerge stronger. As I said before, this stuff happens. It's just the silence. It's just the silence.
We've got some good questions coming in. Some of them are quite tough questions. Also, quite a few people with very similar experience, it would seem, from reading the questions coming in. But first of all, a question from Simon Jackson. Go ahead, Simon.
It's clear from Mummy Amorth that Eton was a family expectation. The extremist wing of the English boarding school system is not for everyone. So I was wondering, with the benefit of hindsight, was it right for you? And have or would you make the same imposition on your own sons?
I've often thought about that. Within the context of the 1980s, Eton was not exceptional. It was perhaps at slightly towards the more extreme wing, but it was part of that society. It was in many ways very damaging because that society that it reflected hadn't accommodated this idea of talking and of grieving. But what it did was it gave me some sort of carapace I calloused up, and for 5 years I was able to get myself through that initial trauma and concentrate on all of those diversions that essentially a school like that offers, and get myself through the other side. What was awful was that there wasn't a single counsellor. The structures that were in place in order to help a boy in my position were they were medieval. It was the house system and any friends you had who might want to talk to you, but my friends didn't want to talk to me about my dead mother because it wasn't a fun topic of conversation.
So do you think all that's changed then, Christopher? I mean, what has changed, and would you go so far as to answer the second part of the question?
No, I certainly will. I mean, Simon asked a question, and a school, just in the same way that our society has changed, and I can name certain symbolically, but also I think substantively important events that have taken place since then, that have meant that our society has changed very substantially. Eton has changed substantially. It's just a completely different place. So when my son said, aged 8, I want to go to Eton, and I had the ability to send him there, I didn't stop him. And he carried on saying that, and he's now in his final year there. His family life is completely different from mine. His experience of school is so different, even before COVID, as to be almost unrecognizable. In the same way that our society has changed, so Eton has changed. And so I have a split opinion on Eton. I have a split opinion on that decision to send him there.
Yeah.
But he would never. He's absolutely thrilled.
I would never send.
Would you have
my
been
son,
disappointed if?
Go on,
Sorry. Would you have been disappointed if he had wished to go elsewhere?
No, not at all. No, that wasn't a factor. He just latched onto this idea very early on, and one couldn't dislodge it. And well, you'll have to interview him in 20 years.
Right. Okay. Nigel Harley. Go ahead, Nigel.
Yes, I mean, in a way, this is slightly sharing my experience. I was 18 years of age. I was getting towards the end of my time at Pangbourne, which was an incredibly tough naval establishment in Dorset, probably even tougher than Eton. I went home for half term. My father was his usual gregarious self. He was in wonderful form. A week later, I was called over by my housemaster to say that my father had died. In fact, he died in the middle of a dinner party, which I suppose is a good way to go if you've got to. And then really there was, just as Christopher said, there was absolutely no support whatsoever. And on top of that, my mother decided in her wisdom that I shouldn't attend my father's funeral. And that was something, I'm afraid, that became a great block between my mother and myself, throughout the rest of her life. It does have a happy note. I had a couple of wonderful avuncular figures. One was actually a blood relation and the other was a very good friend. And they really helped me through the whole thing, but it was immensely traumatic at the time.
Well, I have enormous sympathy for you, Nigel, and I was very nearly prevented by the powers that be from attending my own mother's funeral. And these decisions were taken, I suppose, with the best of intentions. It was considered harmful to expose you to these emotions.
Absolutely.
And nowadays it just seems extraordinary that one could kind of go through life believing this to be the case, that if you don't cry, then somehow you're all right, whereas the opposite is the case. No, I have. It all sounds horribly familiar, I'm afraid.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Laura Hamilton has got this is like slightly like an echo chamber here. So Laura, you've got a similar thing to say as well, unfortunately. Go ahead, Laura.
Can you hear me, Nick?
Yeah, yep.
Yeah, very similar, really. Boarding school, but at the softer girls only end. 17, father had twin brother, identical twin, really his only friend, and very close to me. He was, if you like, I won't say my mentor, but he was my light side of the family. He committed suicide when I was 17, brought into the headmaster's study, told by my father over the phone, not that he committed suicide, didn't find that out until I was in my 50s. And I was expected to tell my younger sister, who was some 3 years younger than me. I didn't feel any resentment against my father for telling me the way he did, because he would have been completely choked up and destroyed by it. But I do in later years feel not enormous resentment, and maybe it's kind of displaced against him, resentments against the school for the, I won't say absence of counselling, because such a thing simply didn't exist, but for the way nobody made any attempt to do anything at all about what we were feeling, and nobody said anything like, for God's sakes, you can't tell your sister, we'll do it for you. Nothing like that. And I wondered whether, Christopher, you felt any form of resentment either at the time or later when you were going through your sort of, if you like, therapy as to getting your head around it, against your father for how he told you what happened.
Of course, I felt enormous resentment. I felt huge resentment. The way I dealt with it at the beginning was by finding those I considered culpable. There had to be culpability. Both for my mother's death, it was unconscionable that someone should be allowed to die in this way, when she was ill, when everyone could see that she was ill, when her family and her friends were dropping her and she was an embarrassment and she was behaving in a way that was distasteful. It seemed to me just extraordinary that people could allow that to happen. It seemed to me to be enormously callous. I then spoke to people who had experience of mental illness and depression at that time, who were able to tell me more about the doctor's approach, the various different approaches that were taken, the different kind of magic pills that were given out. And I'll never forget a woman who had been a good friend of my mother telling me the difference between me and your mother is that I got a good doctor who prescribed the right pills and your mother didn't. And that seemed for a while to be unacceptable. It seemed like the wrong answer. But gradually, as I found out more about her, as I found out more about the long periods of depression that she'd had, which made the lives of those around her very difficult, the more I realized that no one was really culpable. And I think that realization was extremely important for me, because it allowed me to shed this anger and this sense of injustice, which of course, as a 13-year-old, when you've lost your mother, that's what you feel. You know something's wrong, something's gone badly wrong. If you were going to say anything was culpable, it's the entire culture. And my mother was part of that culture as much as anyone else.
How long were you angry with her for?
Well, I was intermittently angry with her because, of course, by committing suicide, you're cutting yourself off from someone who's entirely dependent on you. And as a 13-year-old boy, although you don't know it, you're completely dependent on your mother. And so I was immensely angry with her. I was angry with my father. I was angry with everyone in our sort of social circle, our family circle. But and to go back to the earlier point about the school did what it was programmed to do. Schools didn't do things like help the bereaved children of suicides. They very strongly believed in an ethos of distraction and effort, and if you still feeling a bit down, then just try harder. It was the culture of the time. And now, thank goodness, that has changed. I think our society and these schools, to the extent to which they still exist, I mean, they're the continuation of the schools they were really in name only. They have the same location, the same name, but they're entirely different animals, just as we as a society have changed entirely as well.
Almost. I mean, I did 10 years at boarding school, and the idea of sending I've got two daughters, but both of the schools that I went to are now co-educational, and I went to go and visit my prep school, and it just I must have froze being there, and the idea of them being anywhere associated with it, I couldn't do whatsoever. When you were younger, after you left university, how did that shape your the way you approached work, how you approached life? You clearly were able to deal with it in the last few years, but how did it shape things before then?
Well, I just fled. I did foreign languages, and as soon as I left university, I went away and lived abroad for 15 years. And I didn't really think of coming back until quite late in the day. And my Iranian wife just turned around and said, I think you probably need to spend some time in England. And she was wiser than I was at the time. So for 15 years, I was kind of on the run, to the extent that I had lost touch with most of my English friends, was in intermittent contact only with members of my family, constantly delving into new cultures, learning different languages, kind of adapting or camouflaging. Well, it was something that needed to be confronted.
I don't know much about the psychology of suicide, but I think from what little I know about it, there's a sense of being cut off from the people you love and not being able to have that emotional bond, not being able to see how you're involved with life. All you can see is just, is very, very bleak. Have you looked more into the psychology of it? And to what extent do you think it's affected you and your relationships?
Well, I think I took a conscious decision not to examine suicide in that way. I could have done so, obviously, as a writer or as a journalist, but something stopped me, and I never put forward a freedom of information request to try and find out more. Whether that was a bit of knowledge too far, or whether it was something that I didn't feel would be helpful to me, something stopped me from doing that. But I did start sort of tiptoeing towards my own kind of reconciliation with the subject. I did a piece, a big long read for The Guardian on euthanasia, which took me to the Netherlands, and which is kind of the capital of euthanasia. So obviously that was in the back of my mind as I was doing that. I did a few pieces that were to do with class and the kind of the repressed nature of the English upper class that was useful. Then I did this program that was ostensibly about loneliness with my aunt, but in fact, deep down, I was just getting slightly closer to my own, the real subject that I wanted to address. And then finally, I sort of spewed 50,000 words onto a piece of paper that ended up just 5,000 words in the LRB. I was kind of I was a general approaching a castle from all different angles before finally discovering that it needed to be mined from the western side, and that was the way in. And so in the end, I got in and I conquered the castle. And now I don't have particular interest in the subject. It's not something that that drives me on or that I want to explore further. It was all of these explorations were a means to an end.
I think there's one that's the last few sentences in your piece in the LRB. You talk about the house and the garage where it happened, and your approach to that place. I mean, beforehand you were sort of drawn to it. Could you just talk about that very briefly?
Yes, she shut the door of the garage and then got a hose pipe and fed it into the window. And that house was something that I used to pass. I used to see it, and yes, there was a kind of terrible attraction to it. That one day I would go and live there again. One day I would. It's all somehow linked to this idea of reunification. It's a severance. The first lines of Rumi's Masnavi expresses this severance in spiritual terms, but it's about the reed being severed from the reed bed, and that's what suicide leaves behind. It's this incredibly violent severance, and you, in the end, if you can, you come to terms with that severance, and you no longer dream of putting the reed back into the reed bed.
Yeah, it's baffling, I have to say. A friend of our family, it's happened to them this summer, and it's you can't fathom how. It seems so surprising. You're trying to sort of work it out in so many different ways, and you can't. Ruth Campbell. Ruth, you've got a question there for you. Unplug your microphone.
Thank you very much for sharing your story. You've said that going public about it was an important part of your own journey, and of course you are a journalist for whom speaking to the public is an essential part of what you do. You also said that your purpose wasn't didactic, but I'm wondering whether you thought about the effect it would have on other people. And I also noted you said that you'd had a lot of positive response, which was very important to you. But I'm curious as to whether you've had any negative response, particularly perhaps from people who were close to you.
It's funny within families. You think you're writing something that will be of use to the whole family, and then most people just ignore it, and that is their right. As a writer, I know that I'm writing for myself, and I'm writing for an audience that might find what I write interesting. And this, in that respect, is no different from anything else I've ever written. I haven't had any negative response, but I've had a lot of non-response, and that doesn't really matter to me. I'm not seeking validation from anyone. it's lovely when and if it comes. It's particularly lovely when it comes from strangers, because that is it's a lovely thought. But my aim in this was, I hate to say it, selfish. It was about getting myself well and equipping myself to face the world. And so I don't need the validation of members of my family whom I love dearly, but may not particularly want to read or to listen or to comment. It's not about a grand reckoning, except within my own mind.
But we still don't talk about a lot of these things. I mean, I think it's partly if you think about us, a class thing, and people not. It's still a bit of a bizarre thing to go and see a shrink and talk about things. I mean, I guess there was suicide might cause embarrassment 30, 40 years ago. Now it causes trauma, but still many people won't talk about these things. I mean, we say the stiff upper lip is gone, but I think it's still there in a way.
Well, I think the stiff upper lip is outlives its social dimensions because it is a natural defense mechanism. It's particularly a natural defense mechanism among men, and I think it causes disproportionate damage among men. It's no coincidence that it was my aunt who broke down my stiff upper lip, and I think it does still exist. I don't think it's necessarily a national characteristic only, or even a social characteristic. It's a defense mechanism, and to a certain extent, it has its place. In the initial moment of trauma, you need to concentrate on staying alive. You need to concentrate on just going through your daily routine before you start to take stock and come to terms. But when that process starts, then the stiff upper lip ceases to be a help and starts to become a major impediment to future well-being. And that is just wrong.
And you said 50,000 words got distilled into 5,000. You weren't tempted to write. I mean, I could, when I read the article and I listened to the radio program and also learnt about the history of your family, I actually thought, God, you can make a film out of this. I thought there was a lot more in there.
It'd be a very depressing film, Nick. I mean, I don't know. There are aspects of the story that I still find fascinating. A lot of them I find, very banal and ordinary. A lot of what happens to families happens to every family or a lot of families, and there's nothing very exceptional about it. There's when you're writing about it, the challenge is to distinguish between reminiscence, personal reminiscence, and memoir. The first is something that can only be of interest to you, and the second is something that has a kind of more universal application. So there's a big editorial decision to be taken when you're writing this kind of thing about what is actually interesting to Nicholas Wood and Joe Cleary, and just what isn't. And I'm not sure I fully understand what is and what isn't, but when my editor sent me back those 5,000 words, and I obviously didn't send her 50,000, I sent her something like 10 or 15, then I got a much better idea of what she thought was a universal application. And that is, as I say, the difference between reminiscence and memoir. Yeah,
okay. Yeah. Stuart Williams has got a question, but I'm not too sure if we can get him up. But it's a good question, so I'll ask it on Stuart's behalf. Did the fact that your wife is Iranian and from a different culture help you?
I think it did. I think it. I think that gave me an exit from the very vivid pain that stayed with me, that was extremely useful. But in the end, someone from that very different background was able to recognize on my behalf that I needed to confront what had happened, and you know, all those things that we all really know, and they're sort of cliches. I mean, I can't believe that I even entertain the idea that somehow physically distancing myself from this could possibly help. It's nothing to do with physical distance. It's what's happening inside your head. So, well, she was wise enough to see that.
No, okay, the running away. We have got you here, so we've got to. There are many people who've read your books, who've travelled with you. So we've got to know what you're writing next. You're not going to write more about this. You're not writing a book about this in particular. What are you writing about? I'm
literally days away from completing a book, which is about. It's a history book. It's a book about the Ottoman Empire at the beginning of the 16th century, and it concentrates on 4 of the most remarkable personages of the early 16th century in the Ottoman Empire, who come from such extraordinary backgrounds and all find themselves in the snake pit of the Ottoman Empire, fighting for power and money and influence. One of them is the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire, who was born the son of an animal skin salesman, gets picked up as a slave, sold into slavery, ends up the lover of the Sultan, in all probability, a very, very close companion of the Sultan, and Grand Vizier, the premier, or one of the premier statesmen of Europe. Another is the illegitimate son of the Doge of Venice, who can't climb the greasy pole in Venice. So he comes to Constantinople, becomes the financier of an amazing intriguer, You just wouldn't believe it. The financier of the Ottoman Empire. Another is the Sultan's wife. She beats all the rivals. It's completely unheard of for a Sultan to marry. You just have concubines, but she gets a commitment from him. And then there's the decision of which of the 4 sons is actually going to become Sultan, and all the others, by implication, have to die. And the 4th is a pirate who becomes the Grand Admiral of the Ottoman Navy. And they are fighting out on the biggest stage possible. But they're all very human, and we know an enormous amount about them. We know what they dressed, we know how they spoke, we know what they thought. We're with them as they have conversations with each other. We know their motivations. And it's been just a wonderful book to write. Fantastic. And it is called, and when is it out? It's called, in my head, this is yet to be approved by my editor. It's called The Lion House, because there was a lion house in the Hippodrome in Istanbul, and it contained a bewildering array of animals. Many of them hadn't yet been properly identified. No one really knew what they were. But when it was feeding time, the groans and clanging of the chains would ring out across Istanbul as they went into their feeding frenzy. It just seemed somehow appropriate to these 4 absolutely ravenous characters. Right. Well, looking forward to it. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. If anyone's got a last question, raise your hand or write it down quickly, because we are just about running out of time. I can see Stuart Williams there. We've got Stuart's question in. I hope that was well answered, or answered well enough for you. I'm going to say thank you very much indeed, Christopher. It's been really, really good. It's been a very tough subject to tackle and listen to, but it's been a privilege nevertheless. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you so much for having me, and to everyone who attended. Thank you very much.